Hello, this is your host, Austin Hopkins, and welcome to the Introvert Leader Podcast. Welcome to episode 16. I'm happy you're listening today, and we're going to jump right into it. So here's what I've been into recently. I've been in my rap game recently, and I've been going old school. I've been listening to our guy, Mr. Tupac. You know, I've always been a fan of his music, right? I didn't listen to it a lot growing up because I really wasn't allowed to listen to that kind of music, but kind of fell in love with him when I met my wife. This would probably have been 2012, 2013. And what I love about Tupac's music is I'm not an everyday kind of listening vibe, but it's really good if I'm kind of like in my feelings, right? If I'm a little maybe angry that day, or like I want to blow off a little steam. So I'll throw on a little Tupac, I'll go on a bike ride, I'll do a workout, and I feel a little tough. I feel a little cool listening to it. So that's what I've been listening to recently. Really love his stuff, obviously. And then content-wise on YouTube, I discovered this guy named Alexander the Guest. And he has a channel, and essentially he's an owner of a Michelin star restaurant. And he goes around the world trying all the best food at all of the Michelin restaurants across the globe. So I love seeing the food, right? This is not something I would probably choose to go and pay, thousands of dollars to go and eat at a restaurant like this every day. So it's kind of fun to live vicariously, see kind of what the vibe is. And me and my wife love watching this. And we've become a couple of food critics as a result of this. So anytime, a new dish appears on screen, we're talking about if the presentation looks good and if it's balanced. And it's just kind of fun to look at that kind of stuff and I guess see how the other half lives is a way to say it. But moving on, TVs, movies wise, I recently watched the new Flash movie. And I got to tell you, I had high hopes going into this thing. But ultimately, I was a little disappointed. It kind of felt like a cheap Marvel knockoff. It had a weak story and even worse CGI. Like the CGI was just no good. I still think it's probably worth a watch if you like kind of the DC stuff or superhero flicks, but I wouldn't expect a ton. Updates for me, guys, I'm excited. I'm like 3 weeks away from moving to Arizona. The house is getting packed up. It looks like a war zone in the house. So excited to road trip across the country with the wifey and the pups to our new home. We're just counting down the days. We're trying to fit in some fun things in New York before we go. So we're going up to a cool winery this coming weekend with some of my old colleagues, and my wife's going out to fun dinners in the city, but just excited to kind of start a new chapter, new journey over to AZ. So really excited about that. All right. To wrap things up, I want to give you guys a quote that's kind of set the tone for today. So here's the quote. An eye for an eye will only make the world blind. And that's by Mahatma Gandhi. I'm sure you guys all know who that is. And I like this quote because it really speaks to the heart of what we're going to talk about today, which is office conflicts. So let's jump into it. Why discuss office conflicts? So, I've been involved in my fair share of office conflicts, right? I've been a leader for over a decade, worked in the finance industry for, nearly 15 years. So obviously I was around conflict. Sometimes I was the leader of two employees that were in conflict. Sometimes I was the person in conflict with someone else. And, as someone who absolutely hates conflict, my goal was always been to either avoid it or at least to resolve it efficiently and effectively. So maybe you've had some conflict in your career. Maybe you're going through some conflict with someone right now. Either way, this episode's for you. We're going to break it down, and I'm going to share with you some of the strategies that I've used to, number one, prevent conflict from happening, but number two, how to address it when it pops up. So when I was thinking about the different type of conflict that I've been exposed to in my career, three different things really come to mind. Number one, it's going to be a difference in work styles, right? So obviously we're all different as humans. We were raised differently. We have different experiences. And obviously we're going to in turn have different styles. And unfortunately, this could cause conflict if folks let it, right? I've seen and been in conflicts stemming from a simple difference in styles. And in fact, later I'm going to share a story that kind of illustrates this a little bit more. But what I found is that a lot of times we kind of go into situations assuming sometimes that we're the same. And so those differences kind of catch us off guard and obviously cause issues. I think another one is just simple personality clashes, right? We're all, like I said, we're all different and we have different personalities. For example, quiet people don't always vibe without going more talkative people. Type A folks don't always vibe with type B people. And, knowing this can really help you avoid conflict by accepting the fact that, of course, we're going to be different and we have different personalities. And what I would challenge you and really have you focus on is accepting the personality styles of those that are different from you, right? So don't try to change the people. Don't wish and hope that they're the same as you. Just accept it, right? They're going to be different than you. So the key is once we can accept that, then we can know, hey, this is what's going on. This is how I can approach the situation. And maybe I don't assume that they're going to process and react just the same way as I am. So those are the first two. The last one is really simple. It's communication breakdowns, right? When our communication breaks down, right? When we have misunderstandings, when we have miscommunication, we invite conflict into the space. When two people don't understand each other, it causes issues, right? Even if they have the best of intentions, but if they don't understand what they're trying to communicate and what's going on, it just causes issues. So I found that those really tend to be the most common types of conflicts that I've seen in my career. So we talked about the different types. Now I want to tell you what I believe some of the biggest causes of office conflicts. So number one, it actually ties in perfectly to the last one, which is miscommunication. Communication is obviously the base of everything we do as humans, right? When our communication gets twisted with someone else's, it causes issues. So instead of assuming the worst, next time you ask yourself, is this just a miscommunication, right? And I've seen miscommunication cause more conflicts than you can imagine. In fact, it may be one of the most common causes of office conflicts. A simple miscommunication. You say something, but the other person interprets it a different way. The other person says something and you interpret it the wrong way, right? Because although communication is the base of everything we do as humans, we're not always the best at communicating. In fact, I think that's a big gap in corporate America is the ability to communicate effectively what you're thinking, what you're feeling, what you need. So miscommunication, super big cause of office conflicts, right? Another one that stands out to me is power struggles. And unfortunately, when people are focused on getting and maintaining power, it can cause issues. So power chasing does weird and bad stuff to people, right? I've seen it can corrupt the most awesome people when they start focusing on the power and they're thirsty for that, if you will. And do me a favor, take my advice. Don't worry about the power. If you're not focused about the power and you're just focused on adding value, you're going to have way more influence than you can even imagine. After all, power is really just the ability to force influence, right? But for me, I always thought it would be more fun, more interesting to be able to influence people positively without having to have the title, without having to worry about my power versus them. And this really translates and goes perfectly into the next one, which is ego, right? Ego is something that we have to watch, right? I've seen, again, people focus on how amazing they are and they get these blinders up, right? And when folks start to think that they're better than others or they lack humility, it can lead to conflicts, right? It shows a lack of self-awareness. And self-awareness is something that's so stinking important in your career, in your life. To go around your world, your life, your career, and assume that you're perfect, that you don't make mistakes, that everyone else is beneath you, it's going to lead to conflicts, right? It just is. So ego's a big one. And then the last one that I think is a really common cause of office conflicts would be stress or workload, right? So if you're in an environment where things are stressful or you're overworked, you're going to be less likely to be your best, right? Your patience and your understanding are going to plummet in these environments. They just are, right? You're not your best because there's stress. So you're focused on survival instead of thriving, right? We don't want to be focused on surviving. We want to be focused on thriving. So stress, workload can also cause office conflicts. I've seen it multiple times. Okay, so we talked about some of the most common causes that I've seen for office conflicts. What I want to do is transition and talk now about what is the impact of office conflicts, because there is a big impact when you have those conflicts in your team, in your department, in your company. So here are the three things that I've really found that seem to be the biggest impact of those negative office conflicts. Number one, it's going to be stress, right? Whenever I've been in conflict with someone, I feel so much freaking stress. I hate conflict, right? I'm a recovering people pleaser. So the idea of making someone else feel bad and being in conflict is just makes my skin crawl. I hate it, right? And unfortunately, that conflict takes over my thoughts, right? I start focusing on that. And in turn, it makes me more stressed. So, and I think it all goes without saying, when we're stressed, we're not our best, right? And that really goes perfectly to the next one, which is decreased productivity. When we're in conflict and we're consumed with the situation, naturally our productivity is going to drop, right? I know personally that when I'm in conflict, I'm focused on that. I'm thinking about it. I'm stewing about it. I'm talking about it with my wife. So what does that mean? That means I'm not focused on my work. So, we might think, oh, conflicts are going to show up here and now, and it's no big deal. Personally, I think it is a big deal. So the next one, though, that really, unfortunately, this is the worst case scenario of the impact of office conflicts would be turnover, right? People don't like conflict, right? If the conflict doesn't get resolved in a timely manner, if things are allowed to just kind of fester and stay tense, people are going to leave. After all, who wants to stay working in a negative environment, right? They may not leave today. They may leave in a month. They may leave in a year. Or worse, they might quiet quit, right? So they might just stay in their role, but they're not really in it. So I think it's really important to understand the impact that those conflicts can have, right? And they can really have a big impact on the person and then, of course, on the performance of the team, the department. So now that we've talked a little bit about the impact of office conflicts and how big the impact can be, I want to transition and give you guys a couple of tools, a couple strategies on what you can do to address office conflicts. So again, these are all things that I've done in my career that I've seen the best of the best do, and I know it works. So I'm going to hit you with the first one, the most important one: communicate. Dun, 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 dun. That's the biggest one. Communicate. The best, most time-tested strategy will always be direct communication, right? I told you a moment ago that I hate conflict. And so this one kind of scared me at first, but communicating with the other party and finding a path forward is going to be the most efficient and effective way to find a resolution. And this isn't an email. This isn't a text. This is a call or an in-person chat. That's the way to go, right? Because a text can be misunderstood, an email can be misunderstood, but you can read the person's face or read the tone of voice on a call or an in-person chat. So although, it's so easy to just send a text and share, what's going on with the other person, I'd highly recommend you go with a call or an in-person chat. It's going to be more uncomfortable. You're not going to like it. I don't want to sit here and pretend you're going to enjoy it, but it's the best way forward. The next one, and this one may not be popular, folks, but it's take ownership for your part, right? There's very few situations where one person is completely at fault. In fact, I don't really know of any situations where it's completely one person. None of us are perfect, so own up to your part. Even if all you did was react poorly to the other person or what they did, or even if it's you failed to come to them when you were first wronged or you first felt like they did something that wasn't great, own up to that, right? You'll be surprised that when you own up and when you take ownership for your part, that it brings the guard down of the other person, right? They're more willing to look at themselves. They're more willing to meet you halfway. But if you're not taking ownership for your part and you're just walking around like your shit don't stink, it's not going to work. So next one would be try to see the best in the other person. Right? I have this friend and he has this saying that I always loved. And he says, when you look for the good in others, you tend to find the best in yourself. And I love this quote and I love this saying because I think it really speaks to this, right? Try to find the best in the other person. So in that moment of conflict, it's so easy to get the blinders up, right? To get more entrenched in your viewpoint. After all, you're upset, you're frustrated, you're not thinking clearly. So the mature and the kind mindset to have is one of understanding. So instead of assuming that the other person is just an asshole, maybe come up with a different idea. Maybe come in neutral, or better yet, assume the best of them. Maybe they just made a mistake. Maybe stuff's going on at home. You don't know. And just assume and write them off as just a horrible person is not going to help this conflict. So try to find the best in that person, even if it's something small. Think back to a time where you had a good interaction with them, right? This is something that I think is really, really important. Again, it's going to soften your heart. It's going to allow you to actually find a path forward. And the last one kind of goes with the communication, which is be honest, right? This is a big one. And this is one I've struggled with in the past. There's times where I've been kind of in a conflict with someone and I felt like they hurt my feelings or they did something that I don't think was respectful to me. And in the past, what I would usually do is kind of just let that fester, right? I would just kind of keep it internal. And I got to tell you, it didn't work. And it just kept eating me up. And I did not feel good about it. And ultimately what it was is I didn't feel like I had enough respect for myself to stand up or express how you feel. So gut up, eat the frog, as they say, and share how you feel with the other party. That little bit of uncomfortableness that you're going to have with being vulnerable is going to be overshadowed by your pride that you were honest, right? I've never once regretted being honest and sharing how I feel or what I think the situation was or my perspective. I've never felt a regret about that. But what I have felt regret for is not sharing when I felt like somebody wronged me, when someone did something that wasn't respectful, that was out of line, that they shouldn't have done. So take it from me, be honest, get over the uncomfortableness because it's going to feel so much better after you're honest. So we talked about those 4 strategies on how to address office conflicts, right? Communicate, taking ownership for your part, trying to see the best in the other person, and being honest. So those are the right ways to address office conflicts. But I think you can probably imagine there's some wrong ways to do it. And I'm going to share with you some of the ways that I've handled conflicts in the past that just haven't worked. So the first one is ignoring the problem. Right? Ignoring the problem is easy, right? It's the most comfortable path forward. After all, who enjoys conflict? So in the past, I've told myself, hey, ignoring this problem might work, Austin, right? I hate the conflict and the best way to solve it is ignore it, right? Nope. Ignoring leads to more negative feelings. It's going to make it far, far worse. And eventually it's going to turn it into a bigger situation because you're going to boil over and you might snap and you might say something you regret. So don't ignore the problem. It's not going to go away. The next one that I've done in the past, which is just not any good, and I think it fits perfectly with ego, is hoping the other person will change. All right? Have you ever had a conflict and you kind of just hope that the other person was going to change? Yeah, me too. I thought, hey, they're going to wise up, right? They're going to figure out what they're doing wrong. And, I figured they're going to come to me eventually and they're going to talk about, what they messed up on. And unfortunately, this just never happens. The other person thinks the same thing. So you both are thinking the other person's going to change. And then you have a stalemate on your hands, right? So don't wait for the other person. Take the action yourself. Be the bigger person, right? Drop the ego. Be a little humble. Go chat with them. The next one that I've done in the past and seen others do is blame or finger pointing, right? And blame or finger pointing, no bueno. All of us make mistakes. All of us make the wrong choices at different times. So when we're focused on pointing the blame rather than owning our part, we make the conflict worse, right? The other person is not going to be willing to hear what you have to say. So instead of finger pointing, just try sharing with the other person how you're feeling. Again, be honest, be vulnerable. I don't mean that you have to look weak or spend 30 minutes telling them how you feel, but come up with a concise way to express, hey, here's what I think's going on. Here's how I think you might have not handled this the right way. This is how it's been making me feel. So ignoring the problem, hoping the other person will change, and finger pointing blame, it's not going to work. And I want to give you guys a quick example of a situation back in the day when I was 18 working for a major bank of where I used all 3 of these things. And I'm just going to show you how poor it turned out. So I was 18. This was my first job in banking. And, I had grown up on the farm. So hard work was, I was no stranger to that. And for me, when I was at work, I was focused on the work as opposed to chatting with my coworkers or looking at my phone. That just wasn't my style, right? I wasn't a perfect worker, but I can tell you that when I was at work, that was what my focus was. And I worked with an ensemble team, right? And I had this gal that I worked with. We'll call her Carol. And Carol was a social butterfly. She was around my age and she loved to talk with me and my coworkers and clients a little too much, in my opinion, right? So she would keep people waiting so that she could finish her conversations. And even clients had mentioned to me at different times, like they didn't really love working with Carol because she would just take too much time and she would focus on the things that weren't important at work. So obviously this bugged me, right? This was not my style. She would be trying to talk with me and distracting me, and I just didn't like it. So eventually I just couldn't take it anymore. And so I shut down. So I thought, what, if I just kind of ignore the problem and just kind of be quiet, maybe she'll get the idea. Whenever she would try to engage with me in conversation during the day, I just gave her very little. 1-word answers. I would give her the bare minimum to her questions. I didn't proactively engage with her. And a lot of times I would even make an excuse to leave the area. Like, oh, I got to go to the bathroom. Oh, I got to call my friend, whatever it is, right? And just any excuse to get away from her. And as you can imagine, this strategy did not work. In fact, she picked up on the change in my behavior, my style, and she confronted me about it. And she asked me straight up, like, what's up, Austin? Like, what's going on? And I told her nothing. And this was a lie, right? This was me not wanting to be in conflict, me thinking that it would just go away, and me not being willing to be honest and be vulnerable and share, hey, this is kind of annoying me, the style, what you're doing. So, I lied in that moment. I wasn't honest with her. So fast forward a few days later, things kept getting chilly around there. And eventually, so much so that our manager got involved. He could kind of see that things were not super, comfortable, and things were a little tense. So he met with each of us and kind of asked about the situation. And, I told him everything was fine. Again, not wanting to stir up any more conflict. I thought if I just say everything's fine, they'll just kind of leave me alone and hopefully things will fizzle out, again, ignoring the problem. Well, he was, I guess, emotionally intelligent enough to know that this was not true. So he said, Austin, I can tell something is off with you. And he could feel the tension in the air, and he kept pressing me. So eventually I came clean and told him that I was annoyed with Carol and that she was a constant distraction who wasn't focused on the work, which in my opinion was the reason why we were there. So, to his credit, he thanked me and he requested that I actually chat with Carol about my feelings. So, I reluctantly met with Carol and I shared how I was feeling. And, to her credit, she listened. We went back to work and things got a little better from there. I think she kind of tried to leave me alone as much as she could, but, she was still distracting everybody. And, eventually 6 months later, she transferred out to a new department and, we were fine and ended on good terms. But, this was just a perfect example of me trying to ignore the problem, not being honest, and just hoping things would get better. And it didn't work. So I tell you the story to illustrate the example of handling stuff the wrong way. Ignoring the problem, not being honest, only prolongs conflict. So don't do what I did. Be honest, gut up, tell the person what's going on, how you're feeling, why you think we could improve the relationship, whatever it is, be honest. It's going to pay off. Okay, I want to transition and talk a little bit about what is the role of a leader, right? So we have some listeners here that are going to be leaders, and we have some listeners that are individual contributors. So as a leader, you have a job. You have a responsibility if you see conflict within your team, or if you see one of your team members having conflict with someone outside of your team. And there's really 3 things that I think we need to do as leaders to make sure that we squash conflict and that we help get rid of it as soon as possible. So number 1, you can't ignore the problem or hope it's going to go away. As a leader, it's our job to be highly tuned in to our team dynamic. If you're even halfway decent leader, you should be able to see or feel when your team has conflict. Right? Unfortunately, I've seen many leaders and worked for leaders that just kind of choose to ignore this and hope the problem will solve itself. Trust me, it rarely, if ever, fixes itself. You're going to need to address the conflict in some fashion. And there's 2 different ways you can do it. Number 1, you can empower your team to solve their own conflicts. So when one of your teammates comes to you with a conflict, your job isn't necessarily to solve the problem. Your job is to encourage and empower them to solve it themselves, right? Ask them if they've communicated with the other party. That was the first question I would ask when someone would come to me with a conflict. I would say, have you chatted with them about it? And you should see the look on their face. Every time I'd ask that to someone, you'd see the blood kind of drain from their face and their shoulders would kind of slump. And usually the answer was, well, no, I didn't really tell them. And so then from there, I would say, all right, man, I'm going to encourage you to go have that conversation that you need to have. Now, I didn't just send them on their way. I would role play with them. I would say, hey, man, I'm going to be the other person in this conflict. Let's role play. What are you going to say? And I would help them kind of come up with, the ideas of how they felt they were wronged or how they felt the other person may have let them down in a respectful way, right? And that really seemed to help. And eventually people would go and have those conversations and they would leave that situation a little bit more prepared for the next time. And eventually I would see those people not even come to me and they would just resolve those conflicts by themselves. That's the way to go. That's the gold standard, as they say. But there's also going to be times where that just doesn't work, right? You've encouraged them to go chat with the other person. Maybe they've had that chat and it just didn't work. And that's where you need to step in. So that's number 2. Sometimes you got to step in when needed. So after you've empowered your team to step up and address their own conflicts head on, the problem might still be there, right? Maybe the other party wasn't receptive, or maybe your employee doesn't know how to communicate how they're feeling in a respectful way. This is your cue to step in. And stepping in could look like setting up and facilitating a meeting with the 2 parties in question. So in fact, I want to wrap up by telling you a story where I did just that. Okay, so this takes place a few years back, and I was the leader of a high net worth banking team. Right, this team was tasked with bringing in large deposits and really helping our cream of the crop, our highest net worth members. And you can imagine this kind of work attracted a lot of type A personalities, and some of which who were a little arrogant, unfortunately. And I remember in a really uncomfortable situation that came up between two of the top performers on the team. Both of these gals weren't hired by me, and unfortunately, they weren't the type of employees that I would normally hire. But sometimes that's what happens when you're a leader. You inherit people that you didn't necessarily hire, and you kind of have to make things work, right? So unfortunately, both of them had huge egos, and they thought that they were perfect, right? They thought that they walked on water, that they were God's gift to earth. And I didn't really love that. And, I let it go to the most part, right? Because I can't change someone's ego necessarily. But I started to notice something over the course of the first quarter that I was with them. Both of these ladies came to me to complain about each other. And the complaints were things like, hey, she stole some of my sales, or hey, she shit-talked me to the rest of the team. It was very high school crap, if you ask me, and just stuff, honestly, I don't enjoy. Like, for me, I feel like you can avoid conflicts a lot of times by just doing some of the things I mentioned. So I don't love these things, but as a leader, whatever, right? You have to step in and help. So at this point in my career, I had learned that the answer for most conflicts is communication. So I asked each of the gals to go to the other person with their concerns in a respectful, productive manner, gave them some talking points, helped them prep for the meeting. And a few weeks later, I followed up. Right? This is really important as a leader. You can't just send your team on a mission to do something, to have a conversation and just let it go. It's important that we follow up, right? So I followed up with each of them, and they said things were really about the same after their chat. And I kind of asked, well, how did you guys even have this conversation? And it turns out they had just talked via phone for a quick second, and a lot of it was as well over text and the instant messaging. So I knew at this point I needed to intervene and AKA manage the situation. So I told the ladies that we were going to set up a cage match for the two of them to talk in person. And both of them hated this idea. I swear, they're like, Austin, I don't want to do this. I've said what I wanted to say. She isn't changing. This isn't going to work, Austin. And I said, hey, I hear you loud and clear, but we're going to do it anyways, right? Because sometimes as a leader, you have to just make that decision, right? Your team doesn't always know everything. And sometimes you have a different perspective, maybe a higher level of seeing things because you're less, attached, you're a little bit more removed. So we set up the cage match. And the day of the meeting came. Both of the ladies showed up to a neutral location that I chose. And you could just tell visibly they were nervous and uncomfortable. Both of them kind of walked in at different times. They were both sitting on different sides of the room. They didn't want to go to the conference room where we're going to meet. So eventually I had to go to each and say, all right, it's time for the meeting. Let's go. And, we started the meeting by kind of laying out the situation, right? I was the facilitator. So I kind of, explained what I thought the current state of their relationship was and where I think things might have went wrong. And then I asked each of them to kind of share what they thought the problem was and what their idea for a way to fix it might be. And, both of them laid out their position and why they felt they were wronged. And I did my thing. I just kept asking open-ended questions with the goal of getting to the crux of the issue, right? After that initial kind of context of setting the scene of the conversation, from there, I became kind of more a passive listener and just would ask questions. It wasn't my job to talk the whole time. And I would ask questions and kind of press them to get honest. And eventually they got real and they shared how they felt. Both of them had felt like the other person was stealing from them and they didn't like it. And so they talked about the examples and they kind of talked about a path forward. And as the meeting wrapped up, we talked about the specific things that each of them could do in the future to avoid this conflict. Both parties shook their hands begrudgingly and went their separate way. And this process, quote unquote, worked, albeit just temporarily. And within a few months, one of the ladies actually quit the team, which of course helped the other girl tremendously. And, I was obviously happy to see that one go. She wasn't a great fit for the team, wasn't a good fit for the culture. But I'll never forget this situation because I took away two things that stick with me till to this day. Number one is direct communication is the only solution for conflict. Ignoring, sending a text, sending an IM, being passive, not being honest does not work. Direct communication is the only solution. The next one is hire and work with the right folks, and you're going to have less conflict, right? For me, I knew in my heart when I started working with those folks that they were not the type of people that I wanted to be around. They were not the people that thought like me, that had the right morals, the right values. And, unfortunately, again, you're put in those positions as a leader, and you have to make do with what you have. But my learning from that is in the future, try to get those folks out of your team as quick as possible or hold them accountable for their behavior, right? So I hope that story kind of gives you an example of what I've actually done in the past with my teams to help with conflict. I hope that story in the beginning of where I talked about how I handled conflict the wrong way helps you avoid those mistakes. And I'm hoping you've taken away a couple of different things that you can do, a couple of strategies to avoid conflict and to hopefully get through it as efficiently, effectively as possible. So to wrap things up, I want to give you guys a little challenge, a little something to work on this week. So this week, I want you to walk towards conflict in your life. That's right, you heard me. Don't run away from it. Don't ignore it. Walk towards it. Have a direct conversation with someone and see how you feel after. I guarantee you that you're going to feel pride for being honest, and I guarantee you that it's going to solve the conflict far faster than any other method. So thank you so much for listening to my thoughts on office conflicts. Hopefully you're feeling a little bit more prepared to navigate those as they pop up in your life. As we wrap up, I just want to say again, thank you so much for listening. Right? We have seen some amazing success for the podcast. I'm so proud to share that we're now in over 90 countries we have listeners, and we've just crossed over 5,000 downloads of the podcast in just a little less than 6 months. So it's been an amazing ride. We got so much more fun stuff coming. I got special guests coming. I've got new content. Just really, really excited for the future of the podcast. And it's all possible because of listeners like you who are tuning in, giving me some support. So thank you so much. Make it a great day. This has been the Introvert Leader Podcast. Subscribe for new episodes every other Wednesday.